Welcome to Twin Talk Politics. All right, hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Twin Talk Politics. And on this Tuesday afternoon, we are so lucky to be joined by Dr. Lance Holbert, who is a director of the Leonore Annenberg Institute for Civics, also known as LAIC, and a research professor at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And he is the leading expert and really the go-to person when it comes to political and civics communication, having served the chair of mass communication division of both the National and International Communication Association, was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Communication, and currently serves on the editorial boards of 9 peer-reviewed journals. So it's really our pleasure to speak with Dr. Holbert today. And before we get into any of the questions, how are you doing today, Dr. Holbert?
Well, I'm doing so well, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So as you probably know, we have a tradition on our podcast where the first question for all of our guests is a question of dumb luck. And if it's not already clear by the dead giveaway of our podcast names, we're twins, unfortunately. So we are wondering if you could take that 50-50 chance at who do you think is Jason and who do you think is Jerry, just based on our different colored backgrounds.
All right, so I will go with Jerry in the yellow background.
Oh, unfortunately, that's wrong. I'm Jason in the yellow background, and that's Jerry in the blue. I think I'm slightly chubbier, so if you want any tips in the future, that is how you can separate us apart.
All right. Well, I tried.
Yeah.
No, great. Now that you know how to tell us apart, let's just jump straight into the interview. Now, obviously, Jerry and I know all the incredible things you've done for civic engagement throughout your entire career. But for those who sort of don't know who you are, we were wondering if you could please introduce yourself, maybe some passions that you have in your life, and how you got really interested and involved in civic engagement and communications in the first place.
Yeah, so once again, I'm Lance Holbert. I'm the director of the Leonore Annenberg Institute for Civics here at the University of Pennsylvania and the Annenberg Public Policy Center. My interest in communication and politics, I worked in politics, in US politics, for a number of years as a press secretary. And the idea there was the important role that the press plays in terms of setting an agenda, being able to serve as a conduit or a connection point between elected officials or the representatives of the people and the people themselves. And so I could work within that particular realm to get a sense of how the give and take that would exist between elected officials and the press relative to messages that get out there. And so from there, then I went off to go and learn more about that and to study it, and have done that for several decades. So I'm a quantitative social scientist. So looking largely at the processes by which a range of different political communication outlets, whether it be news or debates or advertising, the way in which it affects, what is salient in people's minds, what is their knowledge level about a range of issues or candidates, what are their attitudes toward them, and then also their behavioral engagement.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And our first question is going to be a little bit more broad. Jason and I obviously know that the LAIC has done so much inspiring work to promote civic education and fostering an informed and engaged citizenry, whether it be through initiatives like the Annenberg Classroom to educate students in the US Constitution, or initiatives like Student Voices Speak Out. And this work feels all the more urgent given today's political climate and growing youth apathy. But for those who are unfamiliar, could you briefly explain what the LAIC does? And as professor, what are your goals for reshaping the civic landscape?
Oh boy. Yeah, that's a big one. So LAIC, yes, the primary vehicle through which its educational products are offered is through Annenberg Classroom. And so what we pride ourselves is on producing high quality, civics-oriented education materials that are nonpartisan, that are freely available to teachers and students and really adults. Anybody that wants to consume that material can do so. And it's a range of different media forms that are utilized, from games all the way up through feature films, and everything in between, and a whole bunch of different lessons. So also, LAIC also serves as kind of the central coordinating agent for the Civics Renewal Network. And the Civics Renewal Network is a little over 40 of really the highest quality civics education organizations that offer a healthy dose of nonpartisan, high quality, freely accessible civics education materials. And so, a few decades ago, a decision was made in this kind of civics education space where there's not a lot of funding, not a lot of money, that everybody was competing with one another. And really what the Civics Renewal Network is to bring all these organizations together and to say, how can they work together relative to furthering the cause of increasing and improving civics education in the United States. The work that we do in LAIC, besides Annenberg Classroom, is that we're also focusing on doing research of better understanding political socialization processes. So what are the different socialization agents within, in teenagers prior to them being, having suffrage, the ability to vote, of what prepares them to be a citizen. So the idea of, you can look at socialization agents as parents or as schools, social media, traditional news, all are different socialization agents that can impact those children relative as they're preparing to be citizens. So there's a lot of work still to do to try to better understand those processes. What works well, what works poorly, how did those socialization agents work either in coordination with one another or in competition with one another? And then also, we're here to try to give school districts and educational institutions an understanding of what's at kind of the major issues of the day around civics education, and advocating for increasing resources for civics education, and promoting raising greater awareness of its importance, especially in these particular times as you were just describing.
For sure. Yeah, just building on that a little bit more. As you said, we know that previously you served as a facilitator for the Civics Renewal Network, where, as you said, you helped unite over 40 nonpartisan organizations to provide really, really high quality and free civic education resources. And as a nonpartisan platform ourselves with similar goals, we're particularly interested in your perspective on the role of nonpartisan media in today's polarized media landscape. Some argue that it is essential for fostering a balanced and informed civic participation in an era of sensationalized partisanship and growing media fatigue, while those on the other side contend that partisan media, through its emotional pull and clear-cut narrative, is actually much more effective at engaging the public, especially the youth, who are sometimes more drawn in by the constant back and forth and slander. So in your view, what role should nonpartisan media play in this political environment, and how important is it to the overall health of democratic engagement?
Oh boy, that's a good one. So the Civics Renewal Network and Annenberg Classroom are nonpartisan in the sense of an education space, but then thinking about news and news media and the idea of nonpartisan media in a news sense. I think one of the challenges that exists today is that there is, we can measure and quantify the degree to which a particular news outlet is offering material that is really right down the middle of the road, nonpartisan, right, versus those that are more or less partisan. Yeah. But with that, it is a matter of, yes, we could offer up that this is a nonpartisan outlet versus this is a partisan outlet, but relative to people's perceptions, all right, in a hyper polarized environment, everything is seen as having a partisan lens, right? So even if you take, let's say in the United States, something like a source like the Wall Street Journal, let's say as an example, the news division, not its opinion pieces, not its opinion section, but just the news section, is very much from everything that we quantify and in terms of measuring these different news outlets is very much down the middle relative to its presentation of materials. It offers a pretty balanced perspective in terms of the major issues of the day. And yet it will be perceived by a wide range of the public as being inherently conservative in nature, right? And there's just as many outlets, like let's say the New York Times or the Washington Post in the United States, that is perceived as far more liberal than it actually is if you actually look at the content. Mm-hmm. So it is important. There's no question that is important for those news organizations, especially like the ones I just mentioned, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, to go about their business of information gathering, really information gathering, and the presentation of news in a really traditional way where you're trying to not favor one side or the other, but simply present the facts as they've been offered to you. And once again, like objectivity, so the idea of objective news, pure objectivity is never going to be reached, right? It's impossible as human beings, or in especially as organizations, but it's something to strive for. And so the idea of in striving for objectivity, it creates certain processes and procedures of information gathering and storytelling that really pushes a news organization to try to stay balanced and nonpartisan in some way. So yes, even though they're not ever achieving objectivity, the very fact that they set that goal puts in place certain procedures that they are going to follow that will try to get them to offer that kind of nonpartisan presentation of the major issues of the day.
Yeah, just building on top of that and just connecting to what we see and characterize as closer to real nonpartisan media is that those types of media are currently losing the information war, often against partisan outlets. So research from Berkeley actually shows that 1 in 7 Americans consumes over 8 hours of partisan media monthly, surpassing newspaper subscribers and the combined viewership of nonpartisan national broadcast news. So if nonpartisan media is essential for fostering more thoughtful civic engagement, how can it gain greater prominence in an environment where audiences often gravitate towards sources that reinforce, as we talked about, their existing beliefs, where Republicans just turn to more conservative outlets and Democrats to more liberal ones?
Yeah, that's honestly, that is the $64,000 question that everybody's going to be is still asking. So no one has figured that out by any means. And you're correct that in the movement toward the digital space, and especially Web 2.0 and into social media and now into Web 3.0 and beyond, that's a space where there's an increasingly, the proportion of partisan or opinion-oriented offerings of public affairs far exceeds the kind of nonpartisan, really information gathering space, because that costs money and it costs a lot. And so as a result, if you're a startup and you're just jumping into it, the idea of having true information gathering prowess is pretty low. So to tell you the truth, I think at the end of the day, people do learn from the nature of their media as to whether the information they're receiving is ultimately of utility or not. And so the utility they're receiving from more partisan outlets is reinforcement. Yes, I'm right. We're on the right track. And there's utility that exists there, but there is also utility that exists in terms of actual high quality factual information. And it's just a matter of when they realize that, and when they come across where they can recognize that from this particular outlet that they've trusted in the past, they offered incorrect information that it directly impacts this person's life in some way. Right. Then that's where trust is beginning to be eroded. But that is a slow process. And one of the big challenges right now is that, especially for more kind of legacy media, let's just call it legacy media, the traditional kind of financial structure for that media, the ground's been cut from under them relative to it. And it's very difficult to especially have any sustainability in terms of profitability. So it's, what you're raising is a massive challenge at the moment. It is one of the things that keeps me up at night, and certainly it's not something that I think anyone has a good answer to yet.
For sure, yeah. Thank you for your insight. That was really insightful and a new, I guess at least for us, a new lens to approach that issue for. So thank you for that. Another part of your work that really stood out to us was your insights on misinformation, specifically the idea of white, gray, and black propaganda. And I'm sure that Dr. Holbert will definitely explain this a lot better than me. For those who are unfamiliar, white propaganda is accurate information from credible sources, while gray and black information propaganda involve misleading or false content, often from deceptive origins. Now, while many people assume that inaccurate information or propaganda exists in a vacuum, you really emphasize how they are actually intertwined. And that's the part that makes them a lot more lethal and a lot more believable. And they become even more persuasive when they tap into pre-existing things such as social cleavages or norms. With the US national election just behind us and Canada's soon approaching, we're seeing misinformation spread faster than we have ever before, often disguised as political rhetoric or amplified by digital platforms, with 71% of American voters reporting encountering misinformation at least a few times in the past month alone. So our question for you is, what advice do you have for young voters, especially first-time voters, on how to recognize and resist misinformation, cut through the sensationalized partisan messaging, and actually figure out what's true?
Sure. So the idea of the different types or the different grades of propaganda is built around the idea that any propagandistic activity involves not simply falsehoods. There always have to be some grains of truth or accurate pieces of information to provide some grounding from which they can then step into realms of misinformation or disinformation. And so it's always a mixture that exists, and that goes along with the accurate sources versus made up or constructed sources. I think it's important to think about, there's a difference between propaganda and persuasion. They oftentimes overlap with one another. And so many of the communication techniques of somebody who's a persuader versus a propagandist are quite similar. But a big thing about persuasion is that persuasion takes place in a competitive environment, right? So there's Coke and there's Pepsi. There's the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. There is, a public health official versus a candy maker or something like that, of saying what's good or what's bad. Whereas a big thing with propaganda is that it's a one-sided message environment. They try to push everything to the side and in order to the opposing messages and have just their message be the dominant one. So that's one thing that's a distinction. For young voters, relative to the idea of how do you find out what is an accurate, a real source versus a constructed source versus what's an accurate piece of information versus an inaccurate piece of information. One thing I always stress is that you need, on any particular issue you're trying to research or better understand, you need to consume a wide range of sources. And so, especially, so hearing one thing from one place is not sufficient. And then also to be able to get a sense of the degree to which, in understanding a media environment where there are multiple sources that you know are coming from different perspectives, what are they saying, right? And so the idea of not embracing any one of them, but taking in a mixture of them and having you then reflect and having a moment to reflect. It's not about choosing which one is right. It's oftentimes making your own position, understanding your own position from that mixture of information. The other thing too is that one thing we have in communication, we talk about what is called the Chaffee principle. And the Chaffee principle is that the most likely effect of communication is more communication. So one thing that you can do is that when you come into contact with a piece of information about, let's say, a major issue of the day, and something is being stated, you're like, well, is that right? Or is that incorrect? Go talk to somebody, not do additional social media searches or anything. I think one thing that's very important that we're losing track of a little bit is the idea of turning what we consume in social media and our various platforms over to actual face-to-face conversation. Mm-hmm. So having conversations with folks in your household about, I encountered X, Y, or Z. What do you think? And it's not that they have necessarily the answer, but the nature of that conversation is additional important piece of information that may further ground you as you try to better understand not just the issue itself, but where you stand on it.
Wow, yeah, that was super insightful. Just the inherent value in communication and discourse. And now we kind of want to move towards another topic that is relatively closely associated with propaganda, which is political advertisement. And with over $10 billion spent on political advertisement in the US, just in the 2024 election cycle alone, and with that number expected to rise, it's clear how central advertisement has become in our increasingly digitized democracy. And we've actually always been super fascinated by this and have been researching it under our own federal representative, but was struck by the ongoing tension with the data, because sources have suggested that positive advertisement increase voter turnout, but rarely change minds. Well, negative advertisements are able to win more votes, but discourage democratic participation due to increased cynicism. And this raises a question that we've always wanted to ask. How can we reconcile the strategic goal of winning elections with the civic responsibility of strengthening democratic engagement?
Oh, that's such a well done relative to the research. So what you've outlined here is this kind of conundrum between what positive versus negative advertising does and what it does not do. So a few things I will try to add relative to that is that thinking on the election side is that one thing that we do know is that negative advertising is roughly 6 to 7 times more effective in terms of people recognizing, when they come to actually recognize, yeah, so-and-so said this in this advertisement, where they can recall that. They will do that 6 to 7 times faster with a negative ad relative to a positive one. Wow. And so the idea here is that you have to, if I'm a campaign, I have to purchase 6 or 7 times the number of positive ads to compete with your one negative ad. Wow. And so just from a money perspective, that's a challenge, right? And so, and part of that, the argument is theoretically is that it is evolutionary in that we as human beings, as we've evolved, that we are hyper aware of the negative things in our environment. So if there is a scary thing in the bush, like we attend to it.
Right.
And so we are hardwired to kind of be more attentive to those negative messages relative to the positive.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing I will say that possibly the past research has not looked at, I think, sufficiently relative to this conundrum that you've just outlined, is that there is a difference in terms of a challenger versus an incumbent offering positive versus negative messages, right? So a challenger who isn't as well known to a voting public, and that person is saying, please come vote for me. If they start off just negative right from the start and you don't know them, people react in a way of, oh, well, I don't like you. Like you're mean-spirited. So they have to begin, the challenger has to begin with a lot of positive messaging in terms of this is who I am, this is what I'm about. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of money. Then they're going up against an incumbent who is already well known, who then can begin with negative messaging earlier, which is naturally more effective. And so in terms of this kind of incumbent advantage that exists globally in democracies, that overwhelmingly high percentage of incumbents are reelected. One incumbent advantage is this ability to use negative messages earlier in a competitive race. And I don't think that that's been really researched quite enough, but it's very clear relative to it in bits and pieces that we have. Relative to the idea of what is our, what's our responsibility, is that, responsibility as, a elected official or a would-be elected official is to be honest with your voters, right? And the idea of being honest, and that has to, so the idea of not lying or not constructing falsehoods relative to the people that you represent is itself important, with balancing the idea that at the end of the day, politics is a competitive environment. And what it is that you win, you have to win. All right. And so, but that doesn't mean always that the ends justify the means. Right. And so the means that you still have to function in a way of being honest with the people you're going to serve or potentially going to serve. But with that is, historically, is that, those particular falsehoods that are offered in advertisements, is that there are third parties that are involved, whether it's a fact check organization or that fact check organization is nested in some journalistic entity where they are holding those, they are deconstructing and reconstructing those messages and offering assessments as to whether the messaging is accurate or inaccurate or whatever it may be. So it's always been part of the dynamic that there are a stretching of the truth, to say the least, in advertisements and puffery that exists in politics just as it does in commercial. But with that, in politics, it's important to have those third parties there to hold, feet to the fire, of which those are once again seen as increasingly more in partisan lenses. So something like a fact-checking organization is seen as partisan. So that creates new challenges that exist.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that response. And especially the part and like the super nuanced part of the incumbent and the challenger. So thank you so much for that. Just moving on, we are really, really intrigued by your idea about the intersection of civic engagement and STEM, especially about the parallel that you drew between scholastic journalism and the scientific method, and the immense value of using civic education to evaluate the reliability of scientific sources. Conversely, we're also curious about how if applying a scientific or STEM mindset within civic sectors might lead to new ways of thinking, problem solving, or even policy design. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, it's such a good question. That's well done. So the idea of I've heard from others, and I completely agree with it, that within civics education of leaning heavy into the scientific method. So if you were asking earlier about the idea of how can young voters address misinformation and disinformation, one tool at their disposal is to utilize the scientific method. The idea of scientific method is as it's operationalized, let's say in journalism, right? So journalists embrace the scientific method in a traditional kind of legacy media orientation, from the standpoint that, all right, let's say that, all right, I've got this one source saying X is happening tomorrow. Well, they need to get confirmation before that is going to, as a policy within a traditional news organization, there needs to be confirmation of that, in that there needs to be a second source, and oftentimes at many news organizations, a third source that says, yes, X is happening tomorrow. So it's not just from one, but it's a second, and oftentimes a third. Well, in a scientific method, or thinking about scientific principles, one scientific principle is replication, right? So the idea of, if I run an experiment and I find something, well, that's great, but I need to do it again and again. And then that gives me more of a confidence that indeed what I found is the case. And so that translates over into journalists with confirmation. It's the same thing as replication. So right. This idea of, so something like a young voter saying, all right, I, from this one source, said X. All right, so let's go, I want to talk to somebody about this. Can they confirm that too? Or is that what they've heard as well? And then, and to kind of diversify that, that's a way to get a sense of, wading through all of this information to kind of say, all right, what can I really rely on? And that doesn't mean it's actually correct, right? It's because the big thing in the sciences is that it is self-correcting as well, right? So I get a piece of knowledge and I offer it out there. That's great. It's an improvement on what we had in the past, but that doesn't mean that somebody else shouldn't come and ask next a better question that leads to even better knowledge than what I produced. And that's the same way that we should think about our own information gathering, that it is indeed self-corrective, and that's okay. This is what I believe right now, but I've learned something new. And from there, I'm going to alter my particular stance, and that's perfectly okay. Whereas I think right now, the idea of, oh no, this is where I stand, and I will be unwavering no matter what information is, and that makes me strong. Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely, in no way, shape, or form does that strengthen you. It's much stronger to acknowledge and have a degree of humility, of recognizing, yes, this is what I have right now based on this particular information, but if I get better information, I may change my position, or that might serve to strengthen it, or whatever it may be.
Wow, yeah. I think just talking about that shift in mindset is something that's so, I don't know, pretty obvious when we talk through it, but it's just not happening right now. But yeah, thank you so much for that. Our second to last question is going to focus a lot more about youth as a whole. So in recent years, we know there has unfortunately been a disheartening rise in voter apathy, evidenced by the declining voter turnout and an overall reluctance just to speak out on issues that truly matter to them. So from your expertise, what has been the most effective way to engage young people politically, and not just ensure that they're well informed, but encourage to take that knowledge to actively participate in our democracy?
Sure. I would say probably two things I think are most important, or what I found to have worked best there, is that one is to afford the opportunity to them, for everybody, for young folks to be able to actually voice their concerns,
Right.
voice their positions, right? To be able to really, and to give them the space to be able to do that. Also, to give them the space and the comfort level, or the level of trust that's needed in a room where they can ask questions, right? And so the idea of, as a fledgling citizen, I don't know how you figure out how to be a citizen without asking questions, and that there is no bad question, right? And so the idea of having a trusted space where they're able to offer voice and speak candidly about what they feel about, or what they think about when a certain issue comes up, as well as to then be able to ask questions about it. And then the other thing that I think is really important is to really teach listening skills. All right, the idea of really the art of listening. And so and then with all of that internal to young folks, is that for adults to genuinely listen and to take in those voices and to want to be constructive relative to playing a role in trying to allow this young individual to be a better prepared citizen in some way. In terms of what can directly lead to behavioral engagement, I believe that is where you move from like the political socialization to much more of a peer-to-peer type of dynamic. So as much as certain like adults may, cajole some young folks to go and get involved and go do this, that's one dynamic to get a sense of what a march is like, or to go do this particular form of community service or whatever else it may be. But then also, I think at that particular age, and as for the teenage years, doing so as a group activity, the idea of having where peer-to-peer engagement, where peers can help foster this type of, not just a one-off form of, let's say, community activity, but then it's not just once and then we're done, but we're going to go back and do it the next week, or it becomes more of a rhythm or more of a habit that is undertaken. That's not going to happen with teenagers in isolation. That's going to happen in groups. So thinking through that kind of teen to teen type of dynamic is exceedingly important when you get to the behavioral end of the scale.
Yeah, that's really cool. Just how democratic participation is often much more communal than we anticipate it to be. So thank you so much.
Very much so. Yeah, we're at the end of the day, we're social beings, right? And so to build that in to our democratic framework and dynamic is exceedingly important in our democratic participation.
Great. So thank you so much for all of your answers today. And now we get to ask the final fun question. So we know that you're a former athlete yourself, and you're even in your high school's athletic hall of fame. So clearly sports are in your DNA. So for our final question, we were just wondering, what's your favorite sports tradition and game to watch at UPenn?
Oh boy. Okay. So so I played golf all through high school and through college, and so that was my particular sport. So I don't really have the time to play that as much as I used to. So I've my father was a professional baseball player, and so baseball has always been part of my family kind of dynamic. And so catching a baseball game at the University of Pennsylvania is a pure joy. But then also at the University of Pennsylvania, we have Franklin Field, which is a historic field, football field. And so that's where the University of Pennsylvania plays within the Ivy League. And so, oftentimes they're playing on Friday evenings. And so going and catching a Friday night game there is always a joy. And Franklin Field is where the Philadelphia Eagles used to play initially when the NFL was actually smaller than college football. And so it has a lot of tradition in it. And the Penn relays are taking place there and everything. So being in that field and in that space, you can feel the history.
Wow, that sounds super exciting. All right. I think that concludes our interview today. Again, Jerry and I would like to extend such an enormous thank you to Dr. Holbert for this amazing opportunity and taking the time out of his incredibly busy schedule to come here and meet with us today. We truly, truly appreciate talking to someone who's inspired a lot of our work and inspired a lot of our future goals, has just been a dream come true. So we truly, truly appreciate it. For the listeners at home, if you guys wish to see more interviews like this, be sure to tune into future episodes. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.